Welcome, adventurers, to the next video in the class comparison video series where we take a look at two similar classes and see how they stack up against each other. Today we are comparing the two monster hunters of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the two classes that somewhat specialize in seeking out a target or sometimes multiple similar targets and hunting them down. Today we have the Ranger and the Thaumaturge. And despite that very big mechanical similarity of being monster hunters, they're actually quite different classes. The Ranger is a core rulebook martial and somewhat of a mainstay of fantasy games and just sort of the fantasy genre, whereas the Thaumaturge is very new to the system and is frankly a word I did not even know until it came out, and I think that is probably true for a lot of people. So why might you choose one over the other? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Let's dive in and find out. Let's start by taking a look at the single target hunting abilities of these two classes, starting with the Ranger, who uses an action called Hunt Prey. Now, you can do this pretty much any time that you have enough information about the designated target that you could reasonably hunt it. So that could be some footprints, it could be you saw them in the distance, something like that. Once you hunt prey, you get a +2 circumstance bonus to seek or track that creature, though you don't actually get a combat bonus, at least not just with hunt prey on its own. Instead, you combine hunt prey with your Hunter's Edge. Hunter's Edge is essentially your subclass as a ranger, and you get very big combat bonuses to the creature that you marked as your prey, but only to the creature that you marked as your prey. And there aren't that many to go over, so we'll actually just list them now. You have 3 Hunter's Edge choices. You have Flurry, which will significantly decrease your multiple attack penalty against your hunted prey. You have Outwit. That will boost your AC against the prey and give you a +2 to Deception, Intimidation, Stealth, and Recall Knowledge checks against that creature. And then Precision will grant you an additional D8 precision damage the first time you hit your hunted prey in a round. And then Rangers can actually pick up additional feats that also apply to the prey that they are hunting. For example, you have Hunted Shot, that is 2 shots with a bow for 1 action, or Twin Takedown, which is 2 melee strikes, 1 with a weapon in each hand for 1 action. The Thaumaturge, on the other hand, uses something called Exploit Vulnerability. As long as they are holding one of their implements in their hand, implement is their subclass, and you can actually pick up more as you go along. So as long as you have your implement and you can see a creature, then you can make an esoteric lore check against that creature. Kind of a lot of terminology in there. If you want to know more details, check out my Thaumaturge video. But for the purposes of this video, what you need to know is that if you pass that check, you uncover a weakness in that creature, and your strikes automatically trigger that weakness. And even if you fail the check, you actually make up a weakness and still apply a little bit of additional bonus damage. So how do these two abilities, the Hunt Prey and the Hunter's Edge of the Ranger, and the Implements and Exploit Vulnerability of the Thaumaturge stack up against each other? Well, let's first talk about when you can use them, because remember that the Thaumaturge requires making a check against a creature that you can see. But Hunt Prey can actually be done at the GM's discretion as long as you're aware of the creature, you have a lead kind of on them of some sort. That means that the Ranger can actually hunt prey before combat begins and not need to spend an action on it in combat. Additionally, Hunt Prey does not require a check. It just works. It's automatic. The Thaumaturge does require a check, and even though you still get some good things, even on a failure, you can actually critically fail, which means you don't discover a weakness and you are flat-footed. But there is an advantage to exploit vulnerability that the Thaumaturge uses. Specifically, the rules state that the damage affects the target of your exploit vulnerability as well as any other creatures of the exact same type. But Hunt Prey only ever works on a single creature. So if you are fighting a horde of skeletons, let's say there are 4 skeleton warriors out there, the Thaumaturge only needs to exploit vulnerability once in that encounter, but the Ranger would actually need to hunt prey on each and every single one of them. So the Ranger is going to be a little bit better at planning ahead, especially if there is a single target. But that Ranger will struggle against multiple targets because they'll have to hunt prey on every single one. The Thaumaturge will have an easier time against multiple targets of the same type, but if the enemies are of different types, then the Thaumaturge doesn't necessarily have a clear advantage anymore. And I think to make up for that, the Thaumaturge does have one other extra ability that their implement gives them. Simply by having an implement in their hand, they are going to deal 2 additional damage per weapon die of their weapon, which is in the other hand. This is using a class feature called Implements Empowerment. So technically, the Thaumaturge doesn't even need to make that esoteric lore check for additional damage through exploit vulnerability because they're already going to have some extra damage from Implements Empowerment. But if you stack that Implements Empowerment damage with that exploit vulnerability damage, ooh, that is nasty. So that is how these 2 classes pile up extra damage on single or on very similar targets. Now let's talk about some of their other abilities, starting with their key ability score. The Ranger is a pretty classic martial with either dexterity or strength as its key ability. So you can be a ranged ranger, or you can be an upfront melee ranger as well. The Thaumaturge, however, uses charisma, and I think this has some really interesting implications. From a combat perspective, this means that the Ranger typically will have higher accuracy and even higher base damage on their attacks. That's because you can get a +4 in strength or in dexterity for that maximum accuracy. The Thaumaturge, though, being charisma-based, will max out at +3 for their strength or dexterity, and that will limit their accuracy and base damage output. But that charisma can lead to a lot of roleplay and exploration abilities of the Thaumaturge. Maybe you lean into demoralizing or fainting in combat. Maybe you're actually the face of the party because you are charisma-based. The strength and dexterity of the Ranger sure can be useful in things outside of combat, you can climb, stuff like that, but I do think it's fun to be a martial who is charisma-based. And I do also think that the slightly lessened accuracy of the Thaumaturge is almost necessary to balance the class because they can do so much damage. Remember, just by holding their implement through Implements Empowerment, they apply extra damage to their strikes. And then they can exploit vulnerability, which still is good even on a failure and is brutal on a critical success, to pile up massive damage that gets around resistances, triggers weaknesses. It is really, really devastating when it all adds up. And if you were as accurate as other martials while doing all that damage, there'd almost be no reason to play anything but a Thaumaturge. Another fun part about both of these classes is that they are martials who do have some magical abilities. Not much compared to some other Gish classes, but they do have some. The Ranger actually can pick up spells through class feats. They are called Warden spells, and they are focus spells. Meanwhile, I really like the magical flavor of the Thaumaturge because they are a dabbler in magical artifacts, and they can actually build talismans and use scrolls even though they are not spellcasters. And I do like that their magic is tied to physical things, since that's what their core implements are as well. They're magical, physical things. So they're kind of, just curators of odd collectibles, I would say. And I do like that the Ranger's focus spells are very outdoorsy focused. They can cast Soothing Mist. They can create a Ranger's Bramble, or you can heal your companion. Companions, let's talk about that now. Both the Ranger and the Thaumaturge can pick up a sidekick. The Ranger actually has access to a full-blown companion, but the Thaumaturge only has access to a familiar. What's the difference? Well, companions are bigger, they're badder, they have more hit points, and they can actually attack. Familiars aren't going to be very helpful in a fight, but they're still a lot of fun. If you are interested in a cute little companion who gives you bonuses to a few checks, then I do think that the Thaumaturge's Familiar is a really great choice. If you're more interested in a fully fledged partner in crime, you might want to be a ranger who focuses on their companion. And on that note of having a partner in crime or not, let's talk about roleplay with these two classes. As I mentioned earlier, the Ranger is a bit more of a traditional martial, and the Thaumaturge is charisma-based, so they're going to be very different. I think there's very good roleplay for the Ranger. You could be a protector of lands, maybe a loner, vengeful hunter, a person who is really bonded with their animal companion. All fun options. But I think that the Thaumaturge has great roleplay options. You are a dabbler, a creative thinker. You make things up, and sometimes you fumble and fail. You maybe charm and schmooze with that charisma. You trick magical devices. But then again, you could interpret all of the Thaumaturge abilities not as being schmoozy, but as actually being dedicated to ancient artifacts, more of a museum curator kind of type. I think there's a huge range of really fun roleplay that you can use with your Thaumaturge. And as far as using these characters in various settings, well, the Ranger is obviously a little bit better suited to being outdoorsy, though there's no reason they couldn't be in a city and be maybe a bit more of a bounty hunter kind of type character. The Thaumaturge feels like they'd be a little more at home, close to civilization, as they do specialize in artifacts, museum curator again, need access to lots of books and ancient texts and that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't say that either of these is restricted to a single setting. So in conclusion, we have two classes that are pretty well dedicated to isolating and exploiting single targets on the battlefield. The way they do so is very, very different. The Ranger is more of a patient hunter using pure martial abilities. The Thaumaturge is a pseudo-magical improviser, I would say. The Ranger picks up a few extra exploration abilities against their hunted prey, but that Thaumaturge stacks up even more damage even after they've already stacked up damage, and sometimes not even on a single target, but on multiple identical targets. And outside of combat, they are pretty different too. The Ranger is at home in nature, is likely very connected to the wilderness or an animal companion. The Thaumaturge delves deep into the esoteric, dark magic side of the world. I think they're both really, really fun, and it just really depends on what character you want to play as. Personally, just my opinion, I do like them both, but man, I really want to play as the Thaumaturge. What about you, adventurers? Do you prefer sort of that classic rulebook, keen hunter's eye of the Ranger, or do you like the imaginative destruction of the Thaumaturge? Let's talk about it in the comments. Until then, remember that both the Ranger and the Thaumaturge are sort of like your shy friend. Not very good in a crowd, but very engaged in a one-on-one conversation. If that conversation involved spears and swords and axes and the like.